Welcome to Energy Vista, a podcast on energy issues where we make experts great again and contribute actively to the public debate and policymaking around commodities, the geopolitics of energy, and trade. I'm your host, Leslie Palti-Guzman. It's April 10, 2026, and time for a new Energy Vista episode. Today, my guest is Mathieu MacManus, retired since September 2025 from the US Department of State, where he worked on international energy and economic issues for more than 3 decades. Matt is now a visiting fellow with the National Center for Energy Analytics, and he has recently authored an issue brief with the National Center on Energy Analytics titled Energy Sanctions as a Foreign Policy Tool, How Successful and for How Long? So, Matt, welcome.
Thank you.
And I think it's going to be a very timely conversation, given the context where we are talking right now. And so we're going to discuss the outlook for sanction policies, particularly in the context of Iran, but we'll chat also about Russia and Venezuela. So the latest war with Iran lasted nearly 40 days. And we have now entered into a phase of negotiation with a fragile ceasefire that seems to be holding for now. Do you think the prospect of lifting the existing US sanctions on Iran that were imposed over nuclear proliferation, terrorism, and human rights concerns are going to be used as a diplomatic carrot in the ongoing discussions?
Well, thanks for having me on the show. It was great to see you for coffee. It seems like a lifetime ago, just last month. And I do think that sanctions are very much fundamental to resolving the current crisis. You see, it wasn't just American sanctions. It was, as you correctly noted, it was unilateral sanctions about backstopping on and slippage on the nuclear commitments. And so these are United Nations sanctions. They're IAEA. And of course, they're bilateral treasury sanctions and also secondary sanctions. I think what my work at the NCEA is doing is really focusing on how sanctions can be used as a diplomatic tool. And we saw the imposition of sanctions on Iran and also the specter more recently of secondary sanctions, where buyers of Iranian oil like India and others in the Indo-Pacific risk sanctions as well. And so that brings us to the current diplomacy. And I was reviewing today the U.S. 15-point plan that was allegedly put through, of course, Pakistan, and then the Iranian 10-point plan. I think what's really interesting is one point of convergence is that sanctions rollback are very important. And Iran went so far on their list to have both primary sanctions and secondary sanctions and United Nations Security Council resolutions and IAEA resolutions all to be removed. And the U.S. plan noted that it would remove sanctions and as well as civil nuclear cooperation. Now, as a retired diplomat, anytime you have two opening statements from both sides and they have the same thing on it, hopefully that's the easy button, right? Hopefully those are areas where the two governments, if the rest of the political and non-proliferation and supporting rogue surrogates in the region, of all those broader, much more important issues are dealt with, then you return to sanctions as a tool of perhaps, the heart of an agreement.
Yeah. We hear a lot in the past few days, maybe the new leaders, even if it's still the IRGC that seems in control, but the new leaders might be more hardcore. Like for me, I see for them a reason to be pragmatic in a way is because the Iranian economy has been severely weakened for years of sanctions, but also because of more structural problems and mismanagement and corruption in the country. But the economy was already very deteriorated before the war began, and now they might be even stronger incentives to rebuild the country and to seek those sanction relief.
So I agree that sanctions really have motivated Iran. First, before the hostilities broke out, it did bring them to the table, and I think that is very important. And they saw unrest in their own community, given their despotic rule for 47 years, and the desire of their people to live in freedom. So you saw the federal budget for next year was very, very hurt by the imposition of sanctions. They were really biting. And I think really what was most concerning to Iran was the secondary sanctions. And this is where, when you talk about sanctions, a lot of people like talk, well, people evade sanctions. But look at the shadow fleet that both Russia and Iran had to fund. They had to send their oil to non-traditional markets on ships they had to buy themselves, self-insure, and then they idled off their markets for many days because there was over 40 million barrels of oil alone in the case of Iran that was stored at sea. And tanker rates, as we know, are through the roof, up more than 600% last year. So this really cost Iran a lot of money. Even if they were able to sell their money outside of the sanctions regime, the opportunity cost of losing traditional markets, as well as all the operational costs of this really rickety shadow fleet, which is also an environmental danger that Russia and Iran have been sponsoring, really has raised, I think, the cost to Iran and brought them to negotiate, not only with the United States, but the world community through the UN that is very concerned about their nuclear ambitions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you mentioned the shadow fleet. It's really interesting because I think now it's maybe about 20% of the
That's correct.
tanker fleet, which is huge in a way. So is it a sign of successful bypassing of the Western sanctions? Or does it really complicate their operation, their logistics? It increases the costs. And we've seen that, and I'm closer to watching what's going on with Russia because of its LNG exports from the Arctic, where we see that it's really a big impediment. Do you see that the same happen with Iran?
Thank you, Liz. I agree. I think it's the latter. It puts a lot of cost on the Iranians. The markets are unsure. And then they have to pay the huge cost of idling tankers off major markets as they try to sell the oil. So if you're an oil exporter, you don't want to sell through a shadow fleet. And this, I do believe, has brought Iran back to the table before the outbreak of kinetic activities.
Mm-hmm. And it seems that we've seen recently the easing of sanctions on Venezuela. And in both cases, for Iran and Venezuela, China was giving a lifeline to these countries by buying discounted oil. Do you think that for the case of Venezuela, China has lost leverage and its position to buy this kind of oil in a way is weakened?
Absolutely. And in the case of Venezuela, there are more unilateral sanctions by the U.S. And you see they also had to resort to the shadow fleet. And so I definitely think that, what people like to talk about imposition of sanctions, but right here, as we talked about at the opening of the broadcast, it's the removal of sanctions are also a diplomatic tool that also give the country or the international coalition that put sanctions on leverage. In the case of Venezuela, there is a lot of leverage remaining because sanctions remain on Venezuela. A series of general licenses from OFAC at the U.S. Treasury Department has allowed American and European and other entities to engage with the government of Venezuela. But this is, again, a trial period where it enables the United States to keep leverage over Venezuela as they're making, admittedly, very welcome reforms in the hydrocarbon law and other areas. Bilateral relations obviously are improving with the exchange of ambassadors, but sanctions are something to be negotiated. And again, the real goal in Venezuela, as well as stability in their several stages, is the return to democratic rule. So I think that also in the case of Iran, you will probably see a roadmap for the removal of sanctions that Iran would have to live up to its part of the bargain, which as we speak this morning, the strait is still closed. So a long road to hoe.
Yes. Now that's very interesting. This use of sanctions, moderate lifting while still applying gentle pressure to make sure that the country is heading into the right political and economic direction. And just to clarify for our audience, so the current revenues from the oil exports from Venezuela, is it the population? Is it the country? Is it the US? Like, what's the arrangement right now?
Yeah, so by both an executive order, it goes into a Treasury designated fund, and then funds are released for the needs of the Venezuelan people, a shopping list, if you will, from Caracas. And so the oil is being sold, and they're getting a better price. China had been taking advantage of Venezuela. They'd gotten a huge discount, but now that Venezuela can sell their oil under the auspices of this program, Venezuela gets a better price, and they're also able to sell to their most natural market, which is the United States, and get full Gulf Coast prices, and that's more money for the redevelopment, the recovery of Venezuela. So you see also the benefit that a country gets from the removal of sanctions, or at least the moderation of sanctions. They get more revenues, and those revenues have been flowing back to Venezuela.
And is there an oversight on making sure that this money is not going to be used for illegal activities or?
Well, I think that's the good thing about putting it in a U.S. designated account. I think first in Qatar, and I think one of the smart, prudent things the Treasury Department did is they removed this money from attachment by creditors. Because in order to let the money return to Venezuela, to help the return to democracy, it couldn't be tied up in court for years. So that makes sure that the money is going to the Venezuelan people. I think the shopping list is vetted by Washington. And of course, now you have a U.S. embassy with Laura Dogu reopened, and you have oversight, if you will, traditional diplomatic oversight on the ground. And here in Georgetown, you have the return of a Venezuelan ambassador, which I think are both very good news, and they're both very good steps. As you know, I've been to Venezuela over 15 times, spent a lot of my younger days as an oil analyst there, and there's a natural, I think, really affinity between our peoples and between our energy sectors, for sure, with the heavy oil and the deep conversion capacity we have on the U.S. Gulf Coast. So the more that we can turn to normal, as we've already seen in the Gulf crisis, that is really helping ameliorate the Iranian threats of continuing to close the strait, because we have galloping production both by Venezuela, more importantly by Guyana, nearly 1 million barrels a day, by Brazil, of course, the American story in the Permian. So the fulcrum of global energy production is really shifting from the Gulf, the Persian Gulf, into the Gulf in the United States, and of course in Brazil.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Like, the easing of the Venezuelan sanctions is impeccable in terms of trying to alleviate the tightness in the market. And before, I have a related questions with Russia, but I wanted to ask you, like, because we mentioned, this kind of mechanism of governing the oil revenues from Venezuela. Do you see a kind of similar system being able to be put in place in Iran? Because we know that in the past, the problem with Iran is that some of the money has been used to fund the proxies or its military weaponries and ballistic missiles and so on. So how are we going to make sure that if the sanctions are gradually lifted, the money will be used also for infrastructure and the general economy of the country?
That's a great question, and I think that the Venezuela situation does provide perhaps a roadmap, and it's certainly something to be on the negotiating table today. And again, it's not just the United States, but these are United Nations Security Council resolutions and sanctions. So I think that you bring in a multilateral entity like up in New York, where you are, the UN, perhaps help oversee some of these funds with the U.S. and our allies.
Mm-hmm. And in order to alleviate further the market right now, some Asian countries and voices would like to see more easing, maybe of the Russian oil sanctions, or at least get some waivers. And some have already bought some cargoes from Russia, and especially right now on the LNG side, I can see maybe India or additional Asian Southeast country that would like to see this oil from the Arctic coming to their countries, and because they are the ones that are suffering the most from the shortage in the market right now. Do you think the U.S. Would kind of close its eyes temporarily? And how is that going to play with the Ukraine-Russia war, which has not ended, and the sanctions are a big stick over the head of Russia, and we know that they have worked in some ways.
That's a great question. And as we know, the 30-day sort of standstill for the ability to sell this floating oil off the Indo-Pacific really ends April 15th. In various packages, Secretary Bessent did relax for a 30-day period oil that had been on the open water in those regions. I would not anticipate that would be rolled over further because, as you know, there's also the Ukraine war to resolve with Russia to keep pressure on. There was a lot of concern that those sanctions were eased, but I think with the Strait of Hormuz closed, it was extremely logical to do that. But again, there's also a date certain when those sanctions are put back on, and they should be, and particularly with LNG as well. There's plenty of LNG in the United States. LNG is subject, as you know, to sanctions both by the U.S. and the EU, and that's really important to keep the pressure on Putin to bring him to the table.
Yeah, on the LNG side, now with Europe almost, later this year they will totally ban LNG imports from Russia.
Correct.
And as a result, that will complicate a lot the logistics of all the Russian Arctic cargoes, because they will have to route around the Cape of Good Hope and Africa to go to China, for example, during winter time when the Arctic route is not navigable. And that is very expensive with the icebreaker tankers, because they cannot use neither European ports now for transshipment. So either they do transshipment elsewhere, more complicated, but in any case, the logistics is much more complicated and costly.
That's right. And again, that's another cost to Russia. And then you have, U.S. LNG will double between 2024 and 2028. So we're bringing on new trains almost every day. More recently in the Gulf, we're looking at Alaska. We're looking at floating offshore production. So the U.S. sector is robust. Competition has increased. Of course, we've seen 20% of world LNG sidelined briefly in Ras Laffan, and maybe 17% of that off for several years. But the LNG market is also one where you see, again, really strongly increasing production and projects being brought on in North America, and including Canada.
Yeah. So actually, in the paper, you mentioned this U.S. energy bonanza as an asset and as an enabler also for these targeted energy sanctions, because it makes the U.S. less dependent on the global oil and gas market and more insulated from shocks. Do you still think that the U.S. it has been more insulated from this most recent shock, but at the same time, we heard a lot of discussion in the U.S. about the price at the pump. How do you think about this?
That's a great question. And so in the span of my 30-year career, I would have been very surprised if the United States was able to sanction any one of these three countries. But by the end of my career, we could sanction all three. And that really is a reflection of the huge increases in the Permian and the huge increases in my home state of Pennsylvania on natural gas. And that American abundance, we can remember how many presidents had to phone OPEC for more oil, or their hands were constrained. So the U.S. is no longer constrained in its foreign policy by energy scarcity. It's now a major energy exporting country, both the largest producer of oil, the largest exporter of LNG, as we know. I think that is very important to our foreign policy. And what a lot of Americans don't understand is that only 20% of our natural gas is exported as LNG. So you didn't really see any change in the Henry Hub price based on the recent crisis because most gas is used here at home. And that's very different than Qatar or Australia or other LNG exporters where it's a much bigger portion of their domestic demand. And in the case of oil, I really like to point out the architecture of energy security founded by Henry Kissinger. I like to note right in a State Department conference room in 1974. Henry Kissinger really correctly figured out you had to have consumer solidarity backed up by 90 days of reserves. The SPR has worked. The IEA has worked successfully, a very successful 400 million barrel draw. Just on Thursday, DOE announced another, I believe, $30 million exchange where they will lend oil out, get more oil back. But as I wrote in the Wall Street Journal last week, when the dust settles, when this is over, we have to rebuild our strategic petroleum reserve, as do our allies, because it's really important, even though we're almost a net exporter of oil, not quite, but we still need robust strategic oil reserves. We have them, but we really need to fill it back to the brim of 700 million barrels. And we also have the ability now, I think there are countries in the Gulf, like Kuwait is one of them, that really has no pipeline to another site. Like the Saudis have the East-West pipeline to Yanbu, which is really a brilliant investment in the energy security of not only Saudi Arabia, but the world. And so we will have empty space in our SPR. And I would propose leasing that space to other producers, particularly those that are vulnerable to a future cutoff.
Very interesting.
So we'll have to have creative ways to rebuild our SPR, again, with market participants, but perhaps with the cooperation of major producers.
Very interesting. You mentioned also in the paper that it might be way too premature to talk about peak oil in the US. And we've heard a lot of discussions prior to the war, some kind of pessimism about the ability from the US to still produce at the same levels oil and gas based on the shale gas productivity and how it functions. Can you address a little bit this? And I think you're very confident in US technologies and ways to find and additional ways to find additional oil offshore or with some federal lands. So talk to us a little bit about this.
That's a great question. And my friend Javier Blas talks it about as like Shale 4.0, right? So you now have the majors who have consolidated their positions in the Permian. And the recovery rate from American shale is only 10%. It's about 30% for conventional oil. So you have a lot of technology, you have additional propping technologies to open up more of the rock. You have more lateral drilling yet further. You have new, they're brewing new surfactants to be able to bring the oil to the surface. And you have AI and 3D seismic. So you're really using all of the technological edge of the U.S. energy sector to bring the recovery rate from the Permian back. Already that's put like 2.4 BCF of natural gas on the market because we know it's often associated with production in the Permian. So you're getting more oil and more gas, and then you're going offshore at deeper depths. You see more bidding from the bipartisan, well, actually not bipartisan, by the big, what they call OBW, the big beautiful bill. You see a lot more drilling offshore, both in the Gulf of Mexico and also the Gulf of America, whatever you choose to call it, and also off of Alaska. So, you have a lot more activity, you have a lot more investment, and you have new technologies, deeper depths, and tiebacks offshore. And I note in the paper that while offshore was going to fall, it's now going to go up by a modest 100,000 barrels per day. But that's a good turnaround. And again, you also have a lot of international investment. I think a good reflection of the U.S. model is it's open to all players. You have a lot of major European companies as well producing in the Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah. So you mentioned bipartisan. I
Right.
was going to ask you if the sanctions in general, do you think through your careers it has been like a bipartisan policy? And are you worried if the next administration is a Democratic administration? Do you think that they would understand the assets of energy exports from the US and the use of energy in foreign policy as an asset?
That's a great question. I think that sanctions have been bipartisan. In the case of Venezuela, administrations of both parties have sort of ratcheted up sanctions there, largely over concerns over Maduro stealing the election. Same case in Iran. I think you have seen bipartisan. You've also seen congressional sanctions on Iran. So I think that you do have a bipartisan understanding that energy is a strategic asset, and that both parties have worked together in sanctions. And I believe both parties benefit from more American production. Last year, we produced a record amount of all forms of energy, but of all forms of energy, 65% is oil and gas. And what is going to
Mhm.
impact our foreign policy is, of course, the exports of that 65%. So 65% is important, and all forms of energy makes more energy available in the U.S. And so I think you really do have bipartisan support for sanctions as a foreign policy tool. Doesn't prevent kinetic action, but I think it delays it, it reduces it. And again, it is a tool that you can have to resolve should you agree to have a diplomatic solution both in Iran and I think more easily in Venezuela. It is a very good tool to have.
Yeah. In terms of outlook, it's way too early to say if Iran will become, Iran has a huge potential in terms of oil and gas production and exports. Do you think that there is potentially a path? And again, there are so many if, and the war could restart anytime. But if the negotiations and an outcome works out for both parties, do you see a potential road for Iran to start exporting more into the international gas and oil market?
I think there are a lot of ifs there, but I do think in the case of Venezuela, the answer is a yes. And I think a lot of people only want to talk Venezuelan barrels if they rival Saudi barrels or if the heavy converters are turned back on. But I think there's a lot. Remember, in the time that Venezuela was largely off the market, that's when fracking took off. That's when Canadian heavy oil took off, and so we didn't need Venezuelan barrels. So just from conventional barrels in Venezuela without any fracking, bringing in new equipment, more modern practices, you have a lot of low-hanging fruit that I think there's a lot more there than people realize. I was talking to a colleague the other day. There's a land rush on. A new landman episode would be great in Venezuela because these tracks are flying off the shelves. Everyone is competing for them. I think there's a lot of economic activity, and the risk is not very high for producing conventional barrels where you can easily get them to market, where you have, again, the general licenses of the U.S. So I think we should watch that space.
And Iran, similarly, do you see the outlook for oil and gas exports over there?
I'm not super optimistic on Iran about where we are today. Let's hope that there will be change within Iran, that it will be a country that people will be willing to invest in. But I think you have some fundamental regime issues there.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, Matt, let's move to a more personal trajectory question. So you've been a career trade negotiator. You spent 3 decades in the State Department, really working on energy security initiatives, and you're an expert on Venezuela. You participated in many meetings with US presidents and secretaries of energy. So you have a very good grasp on how the US evolved from being a major importer of oil and gas to become an exporter. And I'm wondering, like, from personnel at the State Department and other parts of the government, like how the thinking has evolved. Also, like, has the U.S. government finally figured out how to use energy as a tool, as an asset? And for me, it really varied from and alternated from being a non-apologetic proud energy superpower to be not really assuming that disadvantage and almost on the verge of shooting itself in the feet by aborting too soon this big advantage. So where do you think we are right now, and then what's the future for this energy? And I'm talking mostly about fossil fuel because, as you mentioned, it's still 65% of the production of energy in the US.
That's a great question. I think the real challenge for the Congress and the administration is a bipartisan energy permitting bill, right? You need both sides. That will get more American energy around the country. I mean, imagine the state of New York, where you are, doesn't benefit from the shale revolution as much as it could. The rock there is very similar to my home state of Pennsylvania. And then we have we need permitting reform that brings American energy and American molecules from all forms of energy, however it's produced, around the country in an efficient way.
So
And
more
that is going to
pipelines.
really help our economy. It's going to help fuel our data centers. We need as much gas for data centers. My colleague Mark Mills did a great study that showed for if we just assumed 55 gigawatts of energy will be demanded by the new data centers. It'll be 10 BCF just to fuel that. And then we have 15 BCF that has to fuel the increase in LNG capacity. So this country needs to, I think, come together to realize that energy is the backbone of our economy, to work together to get through the Congress. And I think they can. I think this is one of the issues that is close on permitting reform.
Very interesting. So when you say permitting reform, it includes pipelines. What else?
Pipelines, electricity, really moving energy around the country without the bottlenecks we face today. We could bring a lot more gas to market. We could get a lot more electricity again from whatever the lowest cost is. We could get that to market. And that's going to really help our economy. That's going to help us, stand up to these shocks. If you look in the 70s, in the days of Henry Kissinger, we used oil to produce electricity. We don't do that anymore. Many countries are dependent on foreign imported LNG, for example. We produce all the electricity we have here from, again, many forms of American energy. Most countries don't have that luxury. And we're also integrated with Canada and Mexico. And I think there's a real strength there through our North American integration of our energy grid, which we've had for many years now. But we really have to pay attention to permitting reform and increasing the investment climate in our own backyard.
Yeah, and the US will definitely be in a stronger position by doing all the above energy, like not picking and choose, but basically advancing the best technologies and using its competitive advantages wherever they are. Whether in some states it's going to be solar, in other wind, or in other nuclear or geothermal and natural gas, and sometimes coal might be still on for security of supply purposes. But I think that all of the above energy is often the best because it's in a way to do some kind of fuel hedging, because who knows what the future will hold, and so it's enabling to be safe proof with any kind of shock to the system.
I think the real benefit of the U.S. energy grid, I think OPEC learned this the hard way when they tried to swamp the market and put shale gas out of business. They saw the resilience of the U.S. private sector. Sure, some small companies went bankrupt, but they started the next day under a new name. and production came rolling back. So I think an advantage we have compared to our competitors is we have a free market system in energy that allows the investment dollars to go to the highest valued use. And that really is the bedrock of our energy strength.
Yeah. Well, on that note, Matt, thank you so much for joining the Energy Vista podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. This episode was recorded on April 10, 2026. This is Leslie Palti-Guzman saying good day and good luck. If you like what you hear, want to support Energy Vista, discuss sponsorship, or send feedback, contact me